Hi Dan.
Hi, Christian. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good,
Good.
thank you.
Thank you, and welcome to our discussion on architecture. And thank you for your time. I guess I'd like to ask you really early on, what inspires you in architecture? What are you passionate about when it comes to architecture?
Um, a good question. I think my passion in architecture comes from the potential of making new worlds
Hmm.
at its most greatest, most broadest sense, creating new realities.
Okay, talk to me more about how does that manifest itself in your work, do you think?
I think Kay and I have always been interested in people's stories and the personal stories of their lives, and especially in the residential sector that we do, it sort of drives us forward and helps us create potentially unique ideas where we try to draw out their life experiences.
Amazing. So we would love to know more about this project called Edge House. Can you talk a little bit about the process and how you drew these memories out from the client?
Yeah, Edge House is a really interesting project because the client had recently lost her mother. And
Mm.
when I met her on site, Jane, we talked about the project and the potential of building a new house for her. But Kay and I were more interested in why she'd actually bought that plot.
Mm.
Why was it on the edge of a cliff in West Wales? Why was it in the particular town or small village? And we quickly found out that it was actually her, not a holiday home, but a place that she'd visited as a child.
Wow.
So all the memories that she'd made as a little girl were laden in this environment, in the little coves on the beaches. And we were really drawn to that personal connection with place.
You mention a lovely point about the landscape. In Wales, we have a very unique landscape. It's a wonderful and a privilege, I think, to work in the Welsh landscape. What does the Welsh landscape mean to you in contemporary architecture?
Wow, that's a really powerful question. I think my grandfather was a miner. I was brought up in a very small village.
Mm.
My first language was Welsh. And I spent most of my childhood, I think, Dan,
Yeah.
watching raindrops run down panes of glass. Um, one of my first projects was called Petrichor House,
Mm.
and it was a house that celebrated the Welsh rain in North Wales. And that really taught me after our time in San Francisco how much I'd actually missed the green landscape.
You talk in a very beautiful and poetic way about architecture, and it's amazing to hear that. And it kind of gives you like goosebumps, really, if I'm honest. Talk to me about architecture and poetry. Are you passionate about that? What does it mean to you?
Poetry, I think, came to me when we were studying philosophy in the United States. I had a really good professor, and he introduced me to Martin Heidegger.
Mm.
And I remember reading Martin Heidegger's Poetry, Language, Thought. And in the book, the philosopher deconstructs some of the Germanic poets like Holderlin
Mhm.
and kind of makes explicit almost that poets ultimately are trying to recreate a lived experience. And it struck me that perhaps that's what we try to do as architects, is try to recreate an idea or a vision perhaps, and try to gift that to the client.
Mm.
But that's why we try to personify our architecture, because we don't want to give them our interpretation of the site. We want to give them our kind of understanding of their lives and their stories. And I guess what we're ultimately trying to do is trying to create a language, an architectural language from their lived experience.
Mhm.
And that's where poetry enters, because it's a wonderful tool to create connections and similes and relationships between things.
As a guardian of all of that, how have you kind of give us a few examples of how you've demonstrated that in Edge House?
I think with Edge House specifically, it's one thing to try to speak in broad terms of making metaphors or connecting a client's sort of life to memories.
Yeah.
But I think what's exciting about architecture is that you can actually create a tectonic or constructional language that allows that to manifest.
Mm-hmm.
So making sliding screens where you can't see the frame inside the house, but mounting the sliding screen on the outside wall and then sliding that open so that when the client looks out towards maybe a caravan park that they used to stay at,
Yeah.
it literally is a picture frame and there's no superfluous detailing with framing. So you're trying to use the language of architecture to reinforce this dreamlike state of a vision or an idea you've had.
Yeah. Your passion for architecture is infectious. And
Thank you, Dan.
It makes you want to be in those spaces. We don't always have the luxury of a single dwelling and a client that you can get to know on a really intimate basis to bring that out. How might you inspire other architects, other designers who have to maybe work on places where they don't know who the final people living there are going to be? What principles could they bring forward, do you think, from your work?
I think the principles, I always go back to some master projects that have to do with incredibly laborious programs like a hospital. Think of an incredible hospital like the Venice Hospital by Le Corbusier that's unfortunately unbuilt. But the principles of geometry, harmony, proportion, and all those universal ideals were embedded into such an incredibly large project that was an infrastructure project. And I think it was the fact that he just had this incredible sense of care. And I think to care about something is profoundly important. And for Kay and I, it's not so much the type of work that we get involved with, it's whether the client cares deeply about the outcome.
To go back to Edge House for a moment, if I may. Wonderful ideas, really deep, full of poetry, really clearly evident in the final piece of architecture. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
How did you communicate that to Jane?
I think we tell stories ultimately. I think that's what inspires and sort of draws attention. We're still maybe sitting around a campfire telling a story. Ultimately, that's perhaps what we're doing with our clients, is trying to give them reassurance that there's an origin point here, there's an idea, but there's also a destination, which if we get there could be truly phenomenal. And I think at the end of the day, all of our projects are the result of just having incredible clients. I'd like to think that we can take the credit, but truly we've been so lucky over the years to have worked with so many profoundly talented people, from scientists to artists and philosophers. And we almost have to do very little at the beginning, but perhaps it's the hardest thing, and that is simply to listen deeply. Everyone has a profound story to tell. And if we listen to that story, hopefully we can turn that into an architecture. And every project that we've been involved with, Edge House is a great example, always has an idea that is generated from the lives of our clients.
How does all of that, so you got the Hyde and Hyde family, you look to create homes, you spend time and careful consideration on every moment. How do you relate that to business? How do you relate that to running a practice, the practical things of running a practice?
It's interesting because we all watch architects speak on YouTube. We attend lectures, and I've lectured myself and taught myself. But you rarely hear architects talk about the patient search and also the struggles. And architecture is, let's not lie, it's profoundly difficult to take an idea that you've generated and to ensure it complies with all the regulations, and to also try to make it as sustainable and low energy as possible. And also try to sell that dream to a client. And then once you're away with that sort of stage, you've also got to present that to the local authority to get planning. And then you've got to go through all the costings, and you've got to go through the reality of finding a contractor that can execute that to the level and standard that you want, and also to ensure that they make profit. It's an incredibly profound sort of complex series of algorithms, and it just makes me realize sometimes how much we take for granted, and that process actually works at all. But ultimately, I think architects, we could all talk more about how difficult it is, because it is hard. But the reward at the end, it's incredible how you forget all the hardships and the difficulties along the way.
Wonderful. To really conclude, you have a very sense that the work that you do lasts and has a place on this earth for a long period of time. What kind of last message do you want to say to architects, to patrons of architecture, the future commissioners of architecture, about the profession and the kind of importance that architecture can play in the world?
I think the biggest lesson I've had in my own life is how much visiting great works of architecture when you're learning this craft, and how important it is to go on those bus trips with your professors and tutors, and also figure out, where do you go when you enter a library? What's the genre you go to, and try to sort of become a learning machine almost. And I find a lot of people that I've worked with, they sort of stop learning the minute they leave university. And I think they should try to almost find out what really inspires them, motivates them, and to surround themselves in that and do their 10,000 hours, because it opens up new realities, I suppose, and keeps our mind fresh, and also challenges us and stops us falling into almost the status quo where we become almost our own parody. So yeah, I think continuous learning is so important. I can't emphasize that enough.
So just to think about tools and frameworks we could inspire other architects and designers by, the work of Edge House, what can you take from that people could use in any design project as we focus on Design Week?
I think it's interesting because looking back at my own education, I remember sort of devouring Louis Kahn, Le Corbusier, and Frank Lloyd Wright, and all the great masters. But there was something that I've only come to maybe in the last 3 or 4 years, where I've noticed how profoundly talented architects such as Frank Lloyd Wright were at creating proportion, or understanding proportion and scale. And I looked back at some of his prairie houses, and I hadn't looked at them since I was maybe 20, 25 years old. And now a little bit older, I was profoundly moved by it, the proportion of them. And I think we sort of take that for granted these days, how utterly important and critical proportion is, and scale, in manifesting architecture. And I think that's one of the things that we try to work hard on with Edge House, is tying the building in to the ridge heights adjacent. Although we wanted to make a brave and dynamic architecture, we focused on the local sort of typology and the scale of the houses surrounding the site, but equally looked at broad abstract ideas of cantilever and reaching forth out to the ocean. So we had almost a pot of different conflicting ideas about force, scale, but ultimately I think proportion and the way a building looks, not just when you're panning around a 3D model in Revit, but actually how it embeds itself into the site in relation to other things. And I think Peter Zumthor said it really well when he said, I like to think that my buildings feel like they've always been there. Yeah. And I think that has a lot to do with materials and ultimately scale and proportion.
Amazing, thank you. That was truly inspirational for me.
Thank you, Dan.
Gives me goosebumps. I want to wish you all the best as a practice. And on behalf of the RSAW, thank you so much for your time.
No problem. Thank you, Dan.